Today, International Banker is joined by Dr. Gaurav Ganguly, Head of International Economics at Moody's Analytics, to discuss the global economy. Good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the global economy has experienced pronounced shocks in recent years, including the COVID pandemic, accelerating inflation, aggressively tightening interest rates, and, of course, major geopolitical upheaval. What would you say, Gaurav, are some of the key lessons that economic policymakers should have learnt from this turbulent period? And would you say that governments and central banks are now sufficiently incorporating those lessons into their policy decisions?
Well, once again, thank you for having me on the program. I think this is a very sort of a wake-up call for policymakers around the world. This entire decade has been a big wake-up call for policymakers. Core at the heart of it is this idea of building system resilience. All these shocks that come and hit the global economy, from a pandemic to wars of different kinds, energy supply shocks, interest rate hikes, inflation. These all rattle the economy. And policymakers need to be fairly adroit in order to manage these. And they also need to be prepared, as we have seen, for the next shock to arrive, because these shocks have a rather nasty habit of arriving in quick succession. Now, the idea that the world as a whole might have sufficient foresight and resources to anticipate and build up resilience well in advance of the next shock is, I think, a bit far-fetched. But nonetheless, I do think that policymakers have learned various lessons over the past few years and have built up or refined their toolkit in order to navigate the cross currents of the global economy. And I can list a few of these kinds of policy tools. And by the way, I think we're at that stage where more policy rather than less is needed in the global economy. That's for sure. We've sort of done away with the era that prior to 2020, when the world could have sat back and thought, well, we're lowering tariff barriers, we're engaging with each other, we live in a globalized world, there are global supply chains, no pandemics in sight, no wars in sight, no big disruptions in sight. So we can kind of let the economy take over. I don't think that applies anymore. So more policy rather than less is clearly the order of the day. And if you think back to the last 6 years, well, we've seen a lot of policy. We've seen fiscal policy, monetary, energy policy, a broad swathe of emerging industrial policy, defense policy. So all of these are very big areas in which governments have had to think about the operation of the economy and how to best build system resilience. The governments learned a lot from fiscal policy and the pandemic, how the idea that the state really needed to ensure and underwrite the economy if there was a deep recession. You can't just let it go through the economy, it'd be incredibly destructive. But at the same time, learning that you also couldn't just keep writing blank checks. Fiscal policy needs to be targeted, it needs to be efficient. This came back during the energy crisis of 2022, when more targeted measures were applied to protect particular parts of society, the more vulnerable households, certain energy segments of industry, etc. Monetary policy had to respond. Now, raising interest rates, that doesn't end wars, it doesn't open the Strait of Hormuz, but nonetheless it's really important in order to stop energy price shocks from feeding through into the broader basket of goods and services, from feeding through into wages, seeping through into wages, and becoming more structural, inflation becoming entrenched, and economic agents just thinking that inflation expectations are exploding and that inflation is going to become a runaway phenomenon. So in order to do that, to stop all of that from happening, central banks had to respond swiftly in 2022. There was some criticism that they perhaps did not respond swiftly enough, but there's certainly been very much an alert this time around. So I think once again there's been a collective learning that is being applied. Energy policy, Europe had to wake up and realized that it couldn't rely on Russia for gas and had to, in very short order, come up with a very comprehensive policy in order to secure supplies of natural gas. That got tied up with climate policy. Once again, we see that in action, countries thinking about energy policy and trying to figure out what they need to do. Industrial policy and geopolitical shocks. You mentioned geopolitical shocks. Well, countries have to think a lot about industrial policy, and that's not just one area. We're talking about rare earths, we're talking about AI, energy-intensive industries, advanced manufacturing, robotics, all sorts of things. Defense policy. Europe is at the sharp end of it again, wondering how it should meet its own defense needs, for which it needs a concerted defense policy. All of these come together. All of these show the need for policy, more rather than less, but also it's a challenge to coordinate all these different areas of policy. So I'd say governments and policymakers are learning. They've certainly woken up to the fact that they need more policy. Do they have the perfect policy? In some cases, I think policy is perhaps more advanced than its execution. I think you can definitely see that in Europe, and I'm sure you'll come and ask me about Europe later. You can definitely see that here. So there's quite a ways to go yet.
Well, what I'd like to do is actually start in China, because it remains one of the most important drivers of global economic growth for the time being. Now, despite facing key challenges, including property market weaknesses, aging demographics, and rising geopolitical tensions vis-à-vis the West, how do you assess China's medium-term economic outlook? And how would an economic slowdown in China impact global trade, commodity markets, and, of course, emerging economies?
China's growth is slowing. Those heady years of 8 to 10% growth, those are no more, and they're not going to return. I really doubt that. Number of reasons for that. China's got big domestic concerns, big domestic imbalances with its property market. A consumer who is very lackluster, doesn't really want to spend as a high savings rate, it's really worried about the future. It's got one engine now for growth, and that really is its export engine, and that's powering a lot of its growth. So I think we'll continue to see China slowing, because I also don't see huge policy measures underway to revive the consumer and to clean up the parts of the economy that are in trouble. So if none of that happens, then China remains reliant on exports for growth, and it keeps using that as a sole engine for growth. Now that creates a couple of problems. In 2025, China grew by about 5%. 1.6 percentage points of that was net exports. That just goes to show how important net exports really are. Now, if China experiences a slowdown, it's not just about the exports and what it sells to the rest of the world. In order to make all those goods, it also buys a lot from the rest of the world, and that's pretty significant. So that affects directly what happens in other parts of the world. It's not just an arithmetic thing that China's growth goes down to 4%, China is 30% of the global economy hence. It's not just that, it's also that companies in the US, companies in Europe, companies in Asia, all part of Chinese supply chains, or they sell directly into Chinese markets, or they have manufacturing in China. And all of these activities will suffer, and this will lead to weaknesses in other parts of the world. China imports a huge amount of commodities. Massive importer. It's an energy poor country. It imports a massive amount of fossil fuels. It imports a massive amount of copper, all sorts of things. That demand impulse will fade away, which will hurt energy exporters. So you can see that the trade angle will definitely affect the global economy. And then the financial angle, which is that companies sell into China, need the Chinese market. All of that will be quite negative for the global economy. So China is a very important economy, despite moves in recent years to pull away from China, particularly on the part of the United States. Despite all of that, China is a very big global economy, does provide a huge big impulse, so naturally a slowdown in China affects. And now, in terms of your second part of your question, where does China go from here, I think? What's the medium-term outlook? I think that comes back to what I was saying earlier. What does it do about the different parts of its economy? One letter that a lot of people are bandying about a lot right now is the letter K. There's a K-shaped economy because of AI, or a K-shaped economy for various other reasons. China also, in my mind, has a sort of a K-shaped economy. Its export performance is fantastic. It's shrugging off US tariffs and still managing to export to different parts of the world and grow its net exports. But other parts, more domestic parts of the economy, are languishing. Now, if it doesn't do something quite significant to revive domestic demand, then those parts of the economy will continue to languish, and gradually over time this bifurcation becomes more and more extreme. And what does it need to do? Well, in my mind, I think it has to think about how to bring the savings rate down, get people to spend more. That will mean things like pension reform, give people that old age safety net, do things like make it easier for internal migrants within the country who go from rural areas to urban areas to be able to live in urban areas, buy property in urban areas. These are pretty big reform steps. It's talking about these things, but for several years it's been talking about these and we haven't really seen action. So I'm a bit concerned here that none of this will happen. China will continue to focus on its strategic independence, which is what it is doing now in areas such as AI, robotics, chips, rare earths, where it already has a huge amount of independence, and it will also seek to continue to grow its exports. Yeah. That leads to a sort of a muddled picture, because none of that playbook also doesn't necessarily end well. The world doesn't really appreciate too much dependence on China, so that creates a risk. So I think that comes back to the recession problem. It's not just a domestic slowdown, but China's over-reliance on a single engine for growth can create problems in other parts of the world, which can then create quite a lot of dislocation.
Now, you anticipated earlier we'd talk about the Eurozone. The Eurozone policymakers, they seem to be showing growing concern over the region's competitiveness, productivity, growth and investment, especially when compared to the US and China, of course. Now, how do you assess Europe's long-term growth outlook? Do you see any specific policy initiatives having a pronounced impact on Europe's growth potential?
Well, the Eurozone has, or Europe more generally, has a productivity problem that's widely acknowledged. Now, you can go into that and isolate where that productivity problem lies, but at a very high level, that's a fundamental weakness of Europe, and it also limits European growth. So thinking about European growth in the long run is really about how Europe tackles the various issues that underpin this productivity problem. And these are well laid out. I think everybody has a very clear idea what the problems are. The problem is really how to execute on these. Now, the Draghi report, the Letta report, they laid these problems out very clearly, and we understand them. Since then, of course, we've had some more problems emerge. These have been geopolitical in nature. But Europe's manufacturing problem is clear. It has this traditional manufacturing base which is being competed away by China. It's fallen behind quite dramatically, quite badly, vis-a-vis the US and China on AI, and not so much on AI adoption perhaps, but certainly on frontier models and the AI story. It's got an energy problem. It's energy poor, just as China is, and it needs to rely on external partners for energy, and that's been tested. It's got a demographic problem and fiscal problems. And how does it deal with that, with an aging population, and which will test fiscal capacity in coming years? Now, there are solutions to this, and it's been putting into effect some of these solutions. Most notably recently on the geopolitical front by signing trade deals with other countries. These are good. Europe needs to turn the supertanker of trade if the US is not going to be a reliable export partner or a trade partner. It needs to find other avenues, but that will take time to bear fruit. It will also need to think about other areas. I was talking earlier about policy, industrial policy. Europe badly needs industrial policy, and it's crafting industrial policy on chips, on AI rollout, on digitization of the European Union, even on demographics and longevity. So it is clearly coming up with policy measures. There's no shortage of policy measures. Brussels is a massive policy machine. The question really is around implementation of policy. And here, where the rubber hits the road, I think there's a very widespread feeling of dissatisfaction that Europe is not doing enough, or may not even be able to do enough, because of the other problem that Europe has, its fundamental problem, which is one of internal fragmentation. It is 27 member states, and finding consensus and executing on plans that ease the single market, make it easier to do business within the single market. That's difficult. Now, there are again policy moves afoot to make that work through coalitions of the willing. Mario Draghi laid that out in a lovely speech last year, and we're seeing signs of that emerge, particularly in defense. But again, I think it takes time. So I think there's a big question mark around Europe's structural transformation. It recognizes what it needs to do. I think policy messages are very clear. Actually executing on this will be difficult.
A palace of policies lives in Brussels.
Yes, indeed. Exactly. Very well put.
When looking beyond the next business cycle, what do you expect will be the defining macroeconomic theme that will most influence financial markets over the next 10 years or so? And how should financial institutions and long-term investors position themselves to benefit from or protect themselves against that trend?
I think we're in an era of structural transformation. I think everything I've said so far points to that. The idea that financial markets might be driven purely by business cycles is, I think, really a thing of the past. So the next decade, to my mind, is very much going to be marked by structural transformation and the uncertainty that surrounds it. And there's a huge amount of uncertainty that surrounds it. That creates lots of challenges for investors, of course, and how to best position themselves. But three areas of structural transformation that I can point to, and I think they'll come as no surprise. The first is AI and technology generally, and how that gets rolled out. The second is geopolitics and living in a multipolar world and the financial implications of doing so. Yeah. And third really is demographics and fiscal capacity. So on the first, we have seen already the rise of tech companies. We've seen these mega cap tech companies and the lead that America has on AI. And now we are probably at the point where we are looking at AI rollout and what that does more broadly across the industrial base and trying to identify winners and losers. And that's going to take a period of time. Now that might also lead to some moment of reckoning on the valuations of the tech companies themselves. We'll have to wait and see. There's certainly quite a lot of talk about that perhaps there's a bubble in tech. and these valuations themselves aren't justified. But I think really the proof of the pudding is in AI rollout, to see how successfully companies can deploy AI technologies, take advantage of productivity gains, and improve their profitability. Now, that will definitely lead to winners and losers, both within a country and across countries, because there's a wide variety of approaches to rolling out AI, and some countries will be better at doing it than others. The second one, which is around the geopolitics of a multipolar world, I think once again that's a structural issue. We are in a period of fragmentation, and I think this fragmentation is not going to go away. And with this fragmentation comes challenges, particularly for companies with international supply chains, multinational companies and so on. Who do you sell to? Who do you source your inputs from? Who are your friends? Who are your trusted suppliers? I think companies are looking very closely at that and having to figure out strategies to help them cope in this fragmented multipolar world. And there is no clear answer as to how that will work, or the timescale over which that can work out. And I think most importantly, what that means for costs. Globalization was a force for lowering costs, for sure. Activities moved from high-cost locations to low-cost locations, in addition to the fact that companies found new markets. So there was a great force for improving corporate revenues, for growth and for growing companies. We're now talking about retrenching at least a little bit from some of this. I don't think we'll retrench completely. I don't think living in an isolated, completely fragmented world is a possibility by any means, but it's certainly the case that companies are looking to, and countries are looking to, have more trusted suppliers and have more, the concepts of nearshoring, friendshoring, onshoring, these are concepts very much in play, and these have financial implications. Companies that can do this well will be the companies that will once again prove to be winners in all of this. Again, structural change with a lot of uncertainty in how to approach it. And the third one, and this is very important, we don't give it enough attention, I feel.
I was going to say, when you mentioned the demographic thing, I thought we don't talk about that at all, really.
No, we give it very little mention, but it's such a big challenge that so many countries around the world, from advanced economies to some economies that are not yet quite advanced, are experiencing a decline in populations, and will soon be at the point where there'll be sort of a clash of forces, because people will retire in greater and greater numbers, which means that the number of taxpayers in an economy goes down. At the same time, they have more fiscal costs for healthcare and pensions. And this has puts a lot of pressure on fiscal capacity. So I think you've got to think about what that means for demand on the one hand, declining demographics, smaller societies, less demand, and what that does to company sizes, corporate revenues, and on the other hand, what it does to government finances, and the fact that you could be seeing permanent pressure, structural pressure on yields, on government yields, because of governments having to meet extra healthcare costs and the fiscal burden of pensions from people that live quite long. Longevity is quite extended, and there aren't sufficient numbers of people in the workforce to pay tax. That could be offset, of course, through productivity gains, through technology, through AI. But again, there's a question mark around that. And I think these three themes will define financial markets for the next decade, will define economies for the next decade. The fourth is probably climate, if I add to that. We are sitting here in London, and as you know full well, Simon, it's a pretty hot day out here. That adds to pressures on adaptation, that adds to, again, healthcare costs and a whole bunch of things which affect fiscal space. So I think structural transformation, three big things, and if I could add a fourth to that, it would be climate.
So another hotspot, of course, is the conflict in the Persian Gulf. This has highlighted the vulnerability of key energy and shipping routes, particularly the Straits of Hormuz, through which a significant share of global oil and LNG passes. How do you assess the potential long-term economic consequences if geopolitical tensions in the region remain elevated, say, for several years? And beyond the immediate impact on energy prices, which second-order effects from the conflict should investors and policymakers be monitoring, such as inflation, monetary policy, sovereign risks, and, of course, financial stability?
This is a very troubling question, but I think the answer to this lies in how we define geopolitical tensions. What we have seen over the last few months, in terms of the global economy, it's really been about an energy price shock. There are of course geopolitical tensions in the Gulf region, and the GCC countries have borne the brunt of it. The Gulf Cooperation Council countries have borne the brunt of it, but for the rest of the world, it's been very much about an energy price shock. So things are moving forward. in the right direction. This is progress.
A deal has been done, apparently.
Allegedly. We have yet to see what that looks like. And I think the key point, the serious point to that, is that risks are skewed heavily to the downside, still. The oil prices come in significantly, everybody's breathing a sigh of relief. But if negotiations remain deadlocked, or we get back to some kind of stage where oil blockades resume, the strait is closed down completely, I think we'll go back to a pretty bad place pretty quickly. So there's the near term, that if that scenario arises, then it's a very negative thing for the global economy. Energy prices go up again. That means inflation goes up. That means that monetary policy has to react, because people will be concerned about the bleeding of high energy prices into the broader basket of goods and services, and ultimately into wages. But also, we get into this problem of energy security. So far, it's largely been a price problem. There have been pockets of supply problem, scarcity, that have emerged over the past few months, but it's largely been a price problem. If the situation gets worse from here on, we will run into scarcity problems. And that will be pretty negative for quite a few parts of the world. Take East Asia or take Asia generally. Asia is quite reliant on Gulf countries for oil. If they can't get oil, then at some point the reserves start to run out. Southeast Asia doesn't have as deep reserves as East Asia has, so that's a region that will feel it first. But even East Asia will start to suffer. These are countries that rely quite heavily on fossil fuels, rely quite heavily on the GCC, and the longer this goes on for, if this comes back and goes on for a period of time, this will be a significant problem. And I think that explains some of the economic consequences, channels of transmission. It's a global inflation problem if the oil price rises again. It's a monetary policy problem. That puts pressure on yields, of course, but it's also an energy security and scarcity problem, which has broader economic implications. And I'm very, very concerned about that. Now, you could look at this a different way, and if you define geopolitical tension somewhat differently, then perhaps the problem could be more contained. If it is about instability in the region for a period of time, but through that instability, oil and gas continue to flow out of the Persian Gulf, then I think the world looks at the problem differently. It's a much more localized issue, where perhaps international investors are concerned about investing in the region. The region itself, the countries in the region themselves, will be trying to find ways around that, no doubt. They're very good at their policy making record is absolutely excellent. They will no doubt be looking at finding ways around that. But it does become a more localized problem. And perhaps the countries, the oil and gas exporting countries themselves, will have more ability to find alternative routes. And no doubt over time, the oil and gas problem itself might simply become a second order problem. But for the global economy, that's a pretty good thing. It means that fossil fuels continue to flow, the inflation impact is minimized, or it becomes more of a shorter term thing, and the longer term consequences are much more limited. So I think that really depends on the uncertainty, the geopolitical uncertainty around this issue right now, how that evolves.
Thank you for your time today, and it's, I think, been really useful to get that kind of big picture, even though that might actually require people to get into much more local solutions, regional solutions, or country solutions. Thank you very much. It's been very interesting.
Thank you.